Welcome to this video on Wide Sargasso Sea. This is part of my series of videos for A-level students, and in this video we're going to be looking at Antoinette's character primarily and what the other characters think about her. So I've called it Sowing the Seeds of Madness because various characters in this video start to suggest that Antoinette is going mad. As you're watching, make sure as usual you're taking notes, and you can pause the video now to copy down the note-taking video or the note-taking slide at the side there. I think it'd be useful at this point just to have a recap of who the main characters are, because it starts to get a bit more complicated in this part of the novel, particularly because the flow of money through the text is really interesting at this point. So we have Mr. Cosway, who married Annette way before the novel began. Sorry if you can hear some noise in the background, by the way. During the coronavirus, I am recording this while my husband is working from home as well. I hope you can hear me over the top of that. So we have Mr. Cosway, who's married Annette, and Mr. Cosway has died a long time before the novel has begun, and left Annette as a single parent. And Annette's children with Mr. Cosway are called Antoinette and Pierre. Pierre has also died in the fire at the house of Calibri at the start of the novel. And Annette has disappeared. In part one it suggested that she's died, in part two it suggests that she's been locked up. Now Mr. Cosway has had an affair as well. We don't learn very much about that at all, except in part two of the novel the character of Daniel Cosway, Mr. Cosway's illegitimate son and Antoinette's half-brother, becomes quite important. After Mr. Cosway's death, Annette remarried Mr. Mason, who came over from England, and he already has a son as well, Richard Mason, who is another half-brother for Antoinette. And then we have the two servants in this part of the novel, Amelie and Christophine. And of course Antoinette marries Rochester as well at the start of part two. Plot developments, as I said, are quite complicated, so let's just have a quick recap of these. I hope you've read part two of the novel already. So Rochester, a little bit into part two, puts on a facade of love towards Antoinette. Initially, he hasn't been very happy about the marriage. He feels overwhelmed by what's happening to him. But a few pages into part two, he puts on this idea of love, and she appears to be deceived by it. They indulge in their passion for one another, and for a short moment there is hope that the marriage might work. It could be quite interesting for you actually to trace images of transience throughout the novel, so flowers that wilt quickly, or things that are transient that pass away quickly, because these are, I suppose, symbols of the relationship, the short-lived relationship between Antoinette and Mr. Rochester. However, Rochester has doubts about his marriage, and these appear to stem from his concern that his marriage is making him savage, and that's his word for it, that he is giving in some way to the power of another culture. And the anxiety he experiences about this combines with the feeling that he's been bought, and again that's his word. And so he rejects these ideas, but in doing so he has to reject Antoinette as well, because she's the one who's bought him and she's the one who's changing his character. Then Rochester receives a letter from Daniel Cosway. The letter tells him that Rochester has been tricked into marrying into a family which suffers from madness. And whilst it seems clear to the reader that Daniel is just fishing for money, for Rochester this letter confirms his suspicions, and his rejection of Antoinette continues on the basis of it. Immediately after reading the letter, Rochester enters Antoinette's bedroom. Antoinette is being taunted by Amelie, and she also finds out that her faithful servant Christophine is leaving. Antoinette reacts violently to this, so she slaps Amelie, and they start to have a fight. Antoinette pulls Amelie's hair, Amelie tries to bite Antoinette, but this violent reaction really confirms Rochester's fears about his wife. Rochester then isolates himself within the house. He drinks too much, he refuses to spend any time with Antoinette. Antoinette, at her wit's end, visits Christophine, and she tells Christophine that Rochester now calls her Bertha, so he's given her another name. Christophine advises Antoinette to leave Rochester, but Antoinette reveals that in English law she has no money. We also at that point learn that Aunt Cora tried to ensure that Antoinette would keep some money when she married, but she was overruled by Richard Mason. Antoinette begs Christophine for a love potion, And whilst Christophine advises Antoinette that it would be better to talk to Rochester calmly, she also gives her the potion as well, and we'll talk about that more in the next video. Now, looking a little bit more closely at the text then, we see this facade of a utopian situation. So Rochester says, "My fever weakness left me, so did all misgivings." So as he gets better from his illness, his worries, his anxieties about the marriage, they disappear too. And then he went very early to the bathing pool and stayed there for hours, unwilling to leave the river, the trees shading it, the flowers that opened at night. They were tightly shut, drooping, sheltered from the sun under their thick leaves. It was a beautiful place, wild, untouched, above all untouched, with an alien, disturbing, secret loveliness. Then Antoinette joins him in the pool. However, she was certain about the monster crab, and one afternoon when I was watching her, hardly able to believe she was the pale, silent creature I had married, watching her in her blue chemise, blue with white spots, hitched far above her knees, she stopped laughing, called a warning, and threw a large pebble. She threw like a boy, with sure, graceful movement, and I looked down at the very long pincer claws, jagged-edged and sharp, vanishing. "He won't come after you if you keep away from that stone. He lives there. Oh, it's another sort of crab. I don't know the name in English. Very big, very old." As we were walking home, I asked who had taught her to aim so well. "Oh, Sandy taught me, a boy you never met." So what we see here is that Rochester enters this almost perfect existence. He goes and he bathes in the pool. Remember, Antoinette and Tia did that as well when their friendship was in a state of perfection. He goes and bathes in the pool, immersing himself in this landscape that previously he had been overwhelmed by, but now he kind of allows himself to be overwhelmed by it. He's unwilling to leave. You know, he wants to stay in this place. It's almost as if he's been bewitched by it. The trees are shading it, so giving him some protection from the sun. It's a bit cooler. So in lots of ways, Rochester starts to feel a lot better about the landscape that previously he really hated. Then he describes it as being beautiful, wild, untouched. Now that word wild, that adjective I talked about in the last video, has connotations of being completely outside of society. And previously, Rochester had thought that this kind of wilderness was kind of overwhelming, was scary, was frightening. He didn't like it. He wanted to control Antoinette and to stop her from being wild, whereas now he seems to be describing the wilderness as being beautiful. So there's a sense that he is becoming more accustomed to life in the Caribbean. And it's really interesting as well here, the way he describes the natural world is very similar to the way he describes Antoinette elsewhere in the novel. Then we seem to have a turning point here. He starts to realise that the Antoinette that he married is very different from what Antoinette is like now. She's not the pale, silent creature. She's been able to articulate herself, she's given herself a voice, and she's able to do things like throw this stone at the crab. She throws it like a boy, so I suppose she's not quite the perfectly feminine person that Rochester thought she was. And she's got a sure, grateful movement, and that little word sure shows a kind of growing confidence in her. She knows who she is, she's happy within herself, she's got a sense of contentment now that she feels that this marriage is going really well. And then at the end, she says that it was Sandy who taught her to throw the stone. Now, all of these things for Rochester start to cause him to feel anxious about his marriage. So she's no longer silenced, she has a voice. She's no longer kind of pale and quiet, but she's got energy, enthusiasm, a zest for life. She's very good at throwing this stone, which I suppose in relation to the other acts of violence in the novel he might think is quite threatening. She has masculine qualities here, she's confident in herself, and possibly worst of all for Rochester, she has another friend who's a boy outside of the marriage. And so I suppose in one sense Rochester realises that actually maybe he doesn't know his wife very well. But on the other hand, what he's realising is that Antoinette isn't as easily controlled as he wants her to be, and that she is starting to kind of act outside of those ideal stereotypes of femininity that he would like her to remain within. And so he starts to feel threatened by And then slightly later on in this part of the novel, they return home and Rochester and Antoinette indulge in their physical passion for each other. He says, "Die then, die. I watched her die many times, in my way, not hers." And that word "die" is a euphemism here for sexual activity. "In sunlight, in shadow, by moonlight, by candlelight, in the long afternoons when the house was empty, only the sun was there to keep us company. We shut him out, and why not? Very soon she was as eager for what's called loving as I was, more lost and drowned afterwards." Then a little later on he realises, "I did not love her, I was thirsty for her, but that is not love. I felt very little tenderness for her. She was a stranger to me, a stranger who did not think or feel as I did. One afternoon the sight of a dress which she'd left lying on her bedroom floor made me breathless and savage with desire." And then he has a conversation with her about England and London and what London's like, and she's got a very kind of set idea of London that she's not going to change, and he says her fixed ideas would never change. Nothing that I told her influenced her at all. So I suppose what we see here is Rochester losing control of himself, and because of his marriage, or prompted, or at least he thinks prompted by his marriage. So this repetition of the word "die" shows him kind of giving in to sexual pleasure, but at the same time it's okay for him because it's in his way, he's controlling it. And then we have the "we," which maybe suggests this kind of utopian ideal, that pronoun indicating that they're acting together, that they're not separated. And that of course contrasts with the very first line in the novel. They say, "When trouble comes, close ranks," that idea that there are different groups of people. Here we see that actually those separations between people have been overcome. And Rochester's okay with this because he's in control. However, we also do see the motif of death throughout the novel. So we have, as here, death as a metaphor for sex. We also see kind of social death, as in the first line of the novel. They say, "When trouble comes, close ranks." We see a loss of sanity, death as a kind of way of losing yourself and your kind of mental stability. Now they have taken everything away, Antoinette says. "What am I doing in this place and who am I?" We see death as being a loss of identity as well. And death as a means of attaining peace, a desire to escape what's happening. So back to this extract that we have then, we've got that idea, that motif of death that comes throughout the whole novel. And then it changes after that. So towards the middle of this short extract, Rochester admits that she was a stranger to me. And this word stranger, like the word death, echoes throughout the whole text. In lots of ways, Antoinette is strange, she's exotic, she's different, she's not something that Rochester is able to understand. She's also a stranger in the sense that he doesn't know her, and he never attempts to get to know her as well. And then in that next paragraph, when he finds that he's been left breathless and savage with desire, we find that their sexual relationship is changing. So at the start of this, we saw in the previous slide that Rochester was happy with it because he was in control, in my way, not hers. However, what we see here is that he's becoming savage, and that word savage is something that he's used earlier in the novel to describe one of the servants on the island. And it's a word that's used in lots of racist, colonialist texts to represent people who are other, people who are different from the white English colonisers. And so what we see here is Rochester maybe slipping into a different role. He's releasing his inhibitions, and as he's doing that, he's kind of losing his sense of identity as being that kind of patriarchal, upper class English coloniser. And it's the fact that he's being changed by Antoinette that starts to worry him and makes him reject her, because he doesn't want to lose control. He doesn't want to lose that stereotype and that sense of dominance and ascendancy he can have if he remains the white upper class male colonizer in this text. And then in the final line in this extract, we see really important that personal pronoun changes. So her fixed ideas would never change. It's not we anymore. We're back to I and her and them and they and different groups of people. He says nothing that I told her influenced her at all. And again, we see Rochester's fear. Initially, he thought that he could teach Antoinette, that he could form her and shape her into the person that he wanted her to be, and that he was intellectually superior towards her, that he had a greater level of understanding of the world than she did. But when he finds out that actually she thinks that she's in the right, and that she thinks that regarding this topic of London, that she knows better than him, that worries him, and that kind of threatens Rochester's masculinity. And so there are some of the reasons kind of hinted at here why Rochester starts to reject Antoinette and why their relationship starts to go badly wrong. So Rochester's change in behaviour towards Antoinette stems from his desire to dominate her, and as well as that, the microcosm of Caribbean society we see at Grand Bois. His lust for control stems from his entitled upbringing. So as a man within a patriarchal world, a white Englishman in a former colony, an upper-class man surrounded by poverty, Rochester feels that it's him who should be in a position of absolute power. And when Antoinette makes any steps towards threatening that power or taking that power for herself, then Rochester backs off. So when he feels in control, he shows affection towards his wife. Her eyes were so withdrawn and lonely that I put my arms around her, rocked her like a child, and sang to her. And he's infantilizing her here, and he's asserting that absolute power over her. Yet he's threatened by the overpowering natural world, and when the letter arrives from Daniel Cosway, his power is further compromised. It's important to note that the letter comes after Rochester's had all of these kind of feelings about how he should reject Antoinette. It's not the letter that changes Rochester's mind. The letter just gives Rochester the ammunition he needs to reject Antoinette. It confirms Rochester's prejudices and what he already believes. Earlier on in the narrative, Antoinette has asked Rochester if he thinks that, as Antoinette has been told by others, she has slept too long in the moonlight. Now, I suppose one of the problems between Antoinette and Rochester is their lack of understanding of each other's cultures, and perhaps Rochester doesn't pick up on Antoinette's meaning here. When we're talking about moonlight, what Antoinette is saying is that she's gone mad, or that she's going mad. Moonlight is connected with the word lunacy, because if you look at the Latin or the Greek roots of lunacy, lune means moon, and so there's a connection there, a semantic connection between the moonlight and between lunacy or madness. And so what Antoinette is asking Rochester is, do you think that there's something mad about me? She's articulating her fear to her new husband, and so she's attempting to be open with him and discuss what people are saying about her, but it gets her nowhere. But instead, the letter does communicate very clearly to Rochester about this idea of madness. So Daniel Cosway tells Rochester, you have been shamefully deceived by the Mason family. There is madness in that family. I hear too that the girl is beautiful like her mother was beautiful, and you bewitch with her. And here that word bewitch injects a sense of something supernatural as well about the relationship between them, and we're going to see that develop through the use of obeya later on in this section. And Rochester reacts, I felt no surprise. It was as if I'd expected, been waiting for it. So he, as I said earlier, already believed that he should reject Antoinette, and all this letter does is confirm what he already thought. Then, immediately after the letter, and this is an interesting structural device that Jean Rhys uses, immediately after the letter, Rochester witnesses Antoinette slap Amelie's face, and he takes this as confirmation of the letter. So there's been a lot of talk about Annette, Antoinette's mother, about Annette's violence. So she's attacked her husband, she's trying to kill her husband, Mr. Mason. She attacks Antoinette when Antoinette goes to visit her. And so if violence is a form of, or a symptom of Annette's madness, Antoinette's violent behaviour is therefore taken as being symptomatic of her madness as well. But as readers, we can see that there's actually ample reason for Annette to slap Amelie. Amelie has been flirting with Rochester, although he doesn't say that she has very clearly. She's been looking at him in a very intimate way. She's been smiling at him. She's also been taunting Antoinette, calling her a white cockroach. So there's lots of reasons why Antoinette might feel angry with Amelie. And perhaps this act of violence isn't to do with any kind of madness. It's just Antoinette kind of reaching the edge of her tolerance of what Amelie is saying to her. After this, Antoinette reclaims the narrative. So we see her angle, her view on Rochester's treatment of her and her attempt to resolve this. And I've talked about the instability of the narrative and the reasons for that in other videos, so I'm not going to go over that here. And she says, "He always sleeps in his dressing room now, and the servants know. If I get angry, he is scornful and silent. Sometimes he does not speak to me for hours, and I cannot endure it anymore. I cannot. What shall I do? He was not like that at first." And this is Antoinette speaking to Christophine. She's gone to visit Christophine in her house to ask her advice about what she should do with her marriage troubles. And this very emotive speech, helps us to understand the situation from Antoinette's perspective. So there's her real frustration that she can't communicate with her husband, and if she tries to communicate on anything with any level of emotion, he takes that as evidence for her madness. And the fact that he doesn't speak to her for hours and so on, this could be showing us as the reader that actually it's Rochester's treatment of Antoinette that sends her mad later on. And Antoinette seems to be deceived here. She seems to be the betrayed lover. So she says, he was not like that at first. You know, he used to love me. He used to be very close to me and so on. And now it's him who's changed. It's not me. So she seems very much betrayed here, and our sympathies lie with Antoinette at this point. Through Antoinette, then, Rhys articulates the predicament of married women in a patriarchal society. And if you're looking at this from a post-colonial perspective, the extension of colonial power over a former colony. So as evidence of this, let's have a look at this quotation. Antoinette says, "You must understand, I am not rich now. I have no money of my own at all. Everything I had belongs to him. That's English law." So if we were looking at this from a feminist perspective, what we would look at is the unfairness of the male control of the marriage that the money that the wife brings to the marriage. If we were looking at this from a post-colonial perspective, it's interesting that English law applies in the Caribbean, even after the emancipation of the slaves and so on. So what we see is Rochester, and by extension the British culture, causing the disenfranchisement, the marginalisation, the silencing of Antoinette, the woman who is the victim of this. And Rochester has gone a step further as well. It's not just about money. He stripped Antoinette of her identity as well. So he rejects the name Antoinette because it sounds too much like Annette. It has those echoes of madness from Antoinette's mother. And he calls her Bertha instead. Antoinette then turns to Obeah, so she pleads with Christophine to give her a potion to make Rochester love her. Antoinette has attempted to use her body, she's attempted to use her words and her emotions to regain Rochester's affection. And for a disenfranchised woman in the 19th century, she has few other forms of power. She has no legal control over her situation, she has no economic control, she can't threaten Rochester in any way, she can't throw him out of the house, she can't take the money away from him, anything like that. If they had children, it would be Rochester who had control of the children. So in this context, Obeah is the only form of power that remains for her. So that's what she turns to, and we'll look at that in the next video. As a bit of independent learning then, I'd like you to consider this statement. Rochester's cruelty towards Antoinette stems from his need to control her and the society in which he lives. And I've put some suggestions here of reasons, kind of psychological reasons why Rochester is cruel to Antoinette. And what I'd like you to do is copy this table out and then find the relevant evidence from the text. You can look at part 1 or part 2 of the novel, or if you've read ahead into part 3, of course, you can look at that as well. So find some evidence from the text, from what you've read, to support these ideas. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll look at the next section of part 2 in the next video.